Hi, this is Jim Janossy. This presentation deals with learning management systems and teaching and learning online, although it has some relevance to in-class conduct of courses as well. What I'll be presenting here is nicknamed Occam. I'm going to be showing you how Occam simplifies the process of conducting courses online by eliminating a lot of the complexity associated with the learning management system. Many years ago, in prehistoric times, is a Neanderthal named Og. And Og has a son named Newt. What Og wants to do is to train his son Newt to hunt the woolly mammoth. How is he going to accomplish this? Og is the teacher and Newt is the learner. There's one teacher and there's one learner. Teacher is going to impart some knowledge to the learner, but it's going to take place as three separate stages of action. Og is going to tell his son a couple of things about hunting the woolly mammoth, and he's going to show him some things. We might more appropriately call this tell and show rather than show and tell. Newt's going to pay attention to this. Then Og is going to give Newt something to do in applying those skills. Newt is going to respond by doing it, and Og is going to evaluate and correct what Newt has done. And this is going to be repeated with Newt learning more and more about the process and Og giving him more and more complex things to do. How is this relevant? Well, in most college courses, the person conducting the course actually knows the subject to a greater extent than the people who are in the classroom. We're talking here about undergraduate education, and we're not presuming that the learners have any great amount of sophistication in the discipline that's being taught. So in fact, the instructor does know a lot more than the learner does. What is the essence of this relationship? Again, theorizing how this might have occurred in prehistoric times. Well, we could say it's one-on-one. It's a mentoring and a tutoring sort of a relationship that's responsive to the learner. So the teacher is observing how much the learner has learned and can demonstrate and works from that point forward to increase the skill and the knowledge of the learner. This is actually the way humans have taught their young, probably since day one. But this has altered somewhat over the course of time as knowledge became more complex. Let's take a look at what happened in later times. Let's take a look at the Middle Ages and a monastery somewhere in Western Europe. Here we have a picture of somebody we'll call Brother Jerome, and we have some postulants, that is, people who are being trained and accepted into the order. Brother Jerome is the teacher, and the postulants are several learners. The knowledge that's going to be imparted to the learners comes from written materials, but written materials are very scarce. The printing press hasn't yet been invented, so the book that Brother Jerome is able to read doesn't exist in very many copies because copies are very laborious to create. As a matter of efficiency, Brother Jerome is going to gather a group of postulants together, and the relationship will be a little bit different than it was between Og and his son Newt. What's going to happen here is that Brother Jerome is going to read from the book. Now, some of the learners may not be able to read, so even if they had a book, it wouldn't do them much good. But in fact, books are in such short supply that the only person in the room who has one is Brother Jerome. He's going to read, and the learners are going to listen and try and remember. Eventually, Brother Jerome is going to judge how much the learners retain of what's been said. Now, what is the essence of this kind of teaching? Is there really this relationship of going over the material at the pace of the learner? Probably to some extent. If nothing else, the judging process will give an indication of who has succeeded in learning the material and who has not and perhaps needs more exposure to it. The essence of this, actually, we could summarize this way. The teaching was doctrine. That is, the knowledge was not to be questioned. It was coming from a book, perhaps the Bible, and the learners were there to learn it. There was a definite shortage of books. Some of the learners might have been illiterate. And there was a question of efficiency. We didn't have a lot of people like Brother Jerome. We had a lot more postulants than people who wanted to learn what the doctrine was. This was a mechanism of necessity because of these factors. Well, it doesn't take much of a leap of imagination to think about that group of learners as the classroom. In fact, that's what it was. And I strongly suspect that from this point onward, the classroom was enshrined as the mechanism for teaching for this very reason, probably efficiency. Now, what happened between the late Middle Ages and the invention of the printing press in 1453? Well, we've got pretty much the same situation, except let's characterize the essence this way. We may not have simply been teaching doctrine of the church, but we might be teaching everything. There was still a book shortage, more people were becoming literate, but there was this question of efficiency. Without everybody having a book, how are we going to impart the knowledge? It's going to be somebody in the classroom who can read from the book, and a number of people who can attempt to absorb the knowledge by hearing it and remembering it. Let's take it a little bit further. What's the legacy of the Middle Ages up until the 1990s, after the invention of the printing press? Are we still doing the same thing? Well, in fact, we are. Now we're teaching everything. There's no shortage of books. The printing press was invented, and even by 1500, there were millions of copies of books in circulation and over 1,000 printing presses in Western Europe. Books became available. We still have the classroom, we still have the teacher-teller, and we still have the same three stages, except now in the classroom or outside of it, it's presumed the learner can read, can also listen, remember, and apply. And still the teacher will judge the level of accomplishment of the learner. This is the way teaching is done as far as most people would think. And it had an effect on the designers of learning management systems when the web first became available in the 1990s. In fact, the people who first wanted to apply web resources to the learning process thought because of the persistence of the classroom as the vehicle for education, that if they could replicate the classroom, they would accomplish what they had set out to do. That could, in effect, replace the classroom with the learning management system. Still in all, there'd be somebody telling you what's going on and what you're going to have to know. The learner would read, listen, remember, apply through whatever mechanisms the electronic delivery of that could be accomplished. And there would still be an assessment so that the teacher and the teller would be able to tell who had accomplished the required learning and who hadn't. Let's just take this through the years. About 1995, when the first of these systems became available, we have what you see here. The students here are in one or another type of computer lab. Early on, most people didn't have their own computers. Certainly college students would have gone to a lab, and that's where they would have interacted with the learning management system, which had been primed with the right information by someone who had designed the learning. And the books that they were using were physical books that they were expected to buy and have and read. 1996, pretty much the same thing. The web is being refined. 97, pretty much the same thing. Around 1998, PDFs became more popular. Some people decided that it might be a good idea to try and move those books and learning materials into electronic form. So to one degree or another, some of that might have occurred. We still have today, though, in 2011, a great profusion of expensive paper textbooks. This business of putting books into electronic form doesn't necessarily work for everybody. Practically speaking, to put a large book into a PDF may simplify the delivery from the point of view of who's ever creating it and providing it, but it certainly doesn't make it any easier for a person, if they're accustomed to working from print, to have it in that form. Some people can read things electronically. This is not exactly the be-all and the end-all, however, for all learners. Well, what happened subsequently? 1999, pretty much the status quo. 2000, things are being refined. There's more versions of learning management systems around. But they're still pretty much viewing the situation as what you see on this slide. There's an electronic version of the classroom, and the relationship with the instructor is still the same as you see here. 2001, anything new? Well, around 2002, people discovered that MP3 files and small devices to play them created the ability to have digital sound. This is where podcasting became of interest to some people. Now, I've pictured it on this slide as sound out there where the students are, because the first uses of sound really were for entertainment, and that notion has persisted for a great deal of time. Some people thought, we can record lectures. Students will listen to this stuff outside of the classroom. That's an interesting notion, but it hasn't panned out quite that way. However, learning management system vendors took note of this and made some plans to try and bring this sort of capability into the learning management system surrogate classroom. 2003, 2004, finally around 2005, systems started to provide some capability to do this, although even as late as 2009, some of the largest of the LMSs still didn't do a very good job of capturing sound and providing it through the learning management system, which led to a lot of hodgepodge of where you put the stuff so people can hear it. Meanwhile, technology raced ahead, and by 2005, video was becoming prominent on the web. The phenomenon that we see today of video through YouTube was beginning at this point. Once again, out there, outside of the learning management system, vendors will play catch-up with this, but people are already becoming familiar with movies in digital form as they had earlier with sound in digital form. 2006, 2007, a number of things start happening. Finally, some of the LMS vendors start addressing the issue of getting video into and distributed through a learning management system. However, it usually relies on some interface with a video hoster because the idea of video is complex enough that a learning management system probably can't accommodate the size of files and the complexity of those files. But if you take a look at what happened out there with the students, notice that the classroom environment, this electronic classroom of the lab, started to change. People started getting laptops. The laptops made it possible for them not to have to go to the computer lab. So the landscape is beginning to change. 2008, some learning management system vendors decided, well, we can use video capabilities to distribute lectures real-time on the web. Interesting notion. Fraught with technical challenges, some vendors emerged to do that in collaboration with learning management systems vendors, but you'll notice in the upper right corner, the landscape is continuing to evolve. More and more laptops, and at this point, Wi-Fi becoming rather commonplace because people with laptops would rather not have wires attaching them to some fixed location, but would like to be able to move them around flexibly and still communicate at high speed with computers. 2009, now we start seeing another interesting change in the landscape. Portable devices become popular. Smart cell phones, like the iPhone, start to appear on the scene, and people start wondering, how can I make this thing work with learning? Interesting possibilities here, but we have systems that were designed for computer screens, and the devices themselves are much smaller and operate in ways that are far different from 1995, when these notions of a computer as the classroom, the learning management system behind the computer, took hold. 2010, momentous event. Apple introduces the iPad. This is a grown-up version of the smartphone, much larger screen. E-books had become popular by this time, but the iPad really turns the situation on end because it offers full color and high speed, lots of viewing area, and the capability to hook up with Wi-Fi or directly to the internet. Now the question really starts to be asked, isn't this tending towards mobile learning? Isn't this tending towards an environment where we're not going to be tied to computers and wires and even bulky devices, and our schedules are crowding up? To some degree, people are doing this to themselves because they're using these devices for social networking and spending more time on a computer. The whole idea of voluminous printed books becomes burdensome. The books keep getting bigger because textbooks publishers need to appeal to a wide enough audience that everybody and his brother gets to put their 2 cents in. Large numbers of reviewers who all want to be relevant and suggest various things, and the books get bigger and bigger and bigger and more expensive. Well, what is this doing to education? It's working in opposite directions. The learning management system as the focal point grows cumbersome. It gets more complicated too, because it wants to appeal to all sorts of divergent needs. Meanwhile, the devices that people hold in their hands, although internally they're complex devices, they appear to be simple. They have little icons, easily installed applications that more or less install themselves. It works most of the time. By and large, these devices would not be practical as telephones and communication devices if they didn't pretty much work out of the box and well. So we have an expectation here that what supports our activities is going to be like these devices that are easy to use. And people already know how to use these devices. Learning an LMS that's grown more and more complex because of the features it's trying to include becomes complex even for simple tasks. Finally, in 2011, now we have all sorts of portable devices. We have Android devices, we have iPhones, we have iPads by the millions. This is a tendency that's accelerating. And we have people who really are on the go. They are in different places, they want to be in different places, and they still want to keep learning. Meanwhile, we have an LMS that's grown even larger, more complex, more expensive. Isn't it about time we start taking a look at this and start challenging the basic assumption that an LMS that replicates a classroom is really the way to accomplish online learning? That's the premise that I started from in looking at this situation. And what I'm going to show you in the next part of this presentation is a proposal, a model. I've called it Occam as a play on words for something that's simpler, and it's already in use. And it employs these devices, just linking together things that are already available, and miraculously, it's much less expensive, both in terms of finances and in terms of the mental energy, the training time, the hassle that it takes to put a course together. And I'm also going to show you accessed very readily from print media. A lot of issues that have surfaced, even in terms of intellectual property and who owns course material, are addressed by this sort of a model. I think you're going to find it an interesting thing to consider, thinking out of the box, thinking out of the LMS box, thinking out of the classroom. This has revolutionary potential to change your approach to online learning.